Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Leonard, and today I'm going to share with you my proposed dissertation study, Stigma, Sense of Belonging, and Educational Outcomes, a quantitative approach to understanding the internal lateral transfer student experience. And I think understanding why I chose this topic is very much tied to my work at Penn State. I work as the assistant director for transition programs here at Penn State. And Penn State is a large multi-campus institution. We have over 20 undergraduate campuses spread across the entire state of Pennsylvania. And because of that structure, students are able to graduate from any Penn State campus with a four-year degree or transition to another Penn State campus. So some students choose to transition from one of the regional campuses to the flagship campus here in State College. I support these students in their transition as part of my job. So about each fall, we have about 2,500 students transition from the other Penn State campuses to the flagship campus. And we refer to them at Penn State as change of campus students. And one thing that I noticed in my role working with these students is a couple of patterns and some things about their experience that I think really deserve some attention. Primarily in my conversations with these students, they would often mention feeling stigmatized or like they didn't belong on campus because of their identity as a change of campus student. They felt feelings of alienation, like they didn't fit in. The concept of stigma and that not fitting in, not belonging were recurring in my conversations with these students. And so that kind of set me down the path of exploring the connection between the change of campus students' sense of belonging, their experiences with stigma, and what that might mean for their educational outcomes. So whenever I first started thinking about this topic, I knew it would be significant to me and very much significant to my work and my current role. It'll have a direct influence there. But then once I dove into the literature in the field of transfer studies, I really learned that the significance of this research study extends just beyond me and what I'll be doing with this information. I'll talk about my literature review on the next slide in a little bit more detail. But when I was starting to gather research on this topic, I noticed a pretty big gap in the literature. I could only find two studies that utilized a sample similar to mine, and one was published as recently as March of this year. So there's not a whole lot out there on this student population. And I noticed that a vast majority of the literature in the field of transfer studies focuses on students who transition from a community college to a four-year institution. And this type of transfer pathway is super common, but it's not the only one that exists. There is literature out there that focuses on lateral transfer students, so students transitioning from one four-year institution to another, but it is in much fewer quantities than studies that focus on the transition from a two-year to a four-year institution. And then, like I mentioned, even harder to find in my review of the literature was a focus on students transferring from one campus to another within a multi-campus institution. Because this research, it's super sparse, there's not a lot out there on this student population. Even though they haven't been studied that much, thousands of students do make this transition each year, not just at Penn State, but at other institutions as well. And my proposed study will fill that need in the literature. It'll start contributing to the field of transfer studies on this internal lateral transfer student population. And once the research on this population exists, practitioners and institutions will be able to use this research to inform the ways in which they support these students. And it'll also open new doors into further exploration of other various types of transfer student pathways beyond the standard 2 to 4 year transfer pathway. While I conducted my literature review, I focused on three overarching areas: transfer pathways, transfer shock, and stigma and belonging. Depending on the type of institution in which a student starts their academic journey and the institution that they transfer to, that determines on whether their transfer is classified as vertical, lateral, or reverse transfer. One of my sources, Goldrick, Rabb, and Pfeffer, they cite that vertical transfers occur the most frequently, then followed by lateral transfers, and then followed by reverse transfers. Students who begin at a community college and then transfer to a four-year institution, those are our vertical transfer students. The lateral transfer students are those who start at a four-year institution and transition to a different four-year institution, or who start at a two-year institution and then transition to a different two-year institution. And then not as common as vertical and lateral transfers, some transfer students start at a four-year institution and then transfer to a community college, and these are the reverse transfer students. And while these pathways might sound linear, there are also instances of students swirling wherein they transition between institution types multiple times. So the different types of transfer pathways are variant. And as I mentioned previously, this proposed study will focus on internal lateral transfer students. I've classified them this way as internal since they are all from within the Penn State system. They're transitioning from one Penn State campus to another. And then they are also considered lateral transfer since they are transitioning between four-year degree granting campuses. And I'm sure it will come as no surprise to you that no matter what type of transfer a student needs to make, they may encounter difficulty in adjusting during the transition. Just as first-year students need to adjust to their new environment when they enter college, transfer students also have to adjust to their new campus when they transfer. And the literature cites a variety of areas in which they need to adjust, but two overarching categories that were really relevant to my proposed study are the academic and social adjustment. Related to the academic adjustment is the concept of transfer shock. This was coined in 1965 by Hills, and this was the term that he used to describe the trend he saw where students transferring from the junior colleges to a four-year institution experienced a drop in their GPA. And he cited evidence of this all the way back to the 1920s. So he really laid the groundwork for future investigations into the academic experience of transfer students. And decades later, there is still evidence that transfer students experience transfer shock, and subsequent research has shed light onto some of the student characteristics that may influence transfer shock. One thing I found in my review of the literature that I found interesting was that transfer students' institution of origin has played a conflicting role in how lateral and vertical transfer students experience transfer shock. Multiple studies that I saw found that lateral transfer students from one four-year institution to another experience less transfer shock than students who were vertical transfer students. However, a 2015 article by Clausen and Wessel suggested that previous institution type was a statistically significant predictor of transfer shock, with lateral transfer students actually earning a lower post-transition GPA than vertical transfer students. And I thought this was kind of interesting, and the researchers attribute this to the fact that a lot of the vertical transfer students came from community colleges that were really designed to intentionally prepare students for the transition to a four-year institution. So they might have had experiences with resources and supports to kind of build skills to cope with the academic adjustment prior to their transition. So I think this confliction and this variance in the effective institution of origin really supports the need for additional research regarding transfer shock, even though it's been around for a while, and specifically research that focuses on lateral transfer students. And then I'll further narrow it down to internal lateral transfer students in my proposed study. Just as transfer students have difficulty adjusting to the new academic environment, the social environment of the receiving institution may also pose challenges. One element of transfer students' social adjustment is the development of their sense of belonging at their new campus. And my proposed study utilizes Strayhorn's definition of belonging as students perceive social support, connectedness, and mattering on campus. And for some transfer students, their social adjustment and a development of a sense of belonging might be impeded by stigma. They might experience stigma on their receiving campus. This was something that was reported in multiple studies that transfer students reported feeling a sense of stigma associated with their transfer identity. Specifically, Owen's 2010 study found that in the first few weeks of their first semester at their new institution, nearly all of the transfer students in the study reported concerns fitting in at the receiving institution, and a majority expressed that they directly experienced feelings of marginality. This is consistent with a study by Leonard, which found that experiencing stigma related to the transfer student identity was a statistically significant predictor of community college students' ability to adjust academically, and those who experienced stigma reported lower levels of adjustment. One thing to note is that the research on transfer students' experiences with belonging and stigma don't focus solely on lateral transfer students. In the research I found, the studies either exclusively focused on vertical transfer students, or the studies did not separate vertical and lateral transfer students, and the results were discussed in aggregate. So this proposed study will integrate some of that current knowledge from the field of transfer studies to really investigate how stigma and belonging influence the internal lateral transfer students' educational outcomes. Prior to this proposed study, I couldn't find any research that is directly tied together the concepts of transfer shock, belonging, and stigma for this student population. So my proposed study does seek to fill that gap. Additionally, I'll be using Schlossberg's transition theory as the backbone for this study. Schlossberg in this theory has identified 4 factors that influence whether or not an individual is able to cope with a transition. And those are the situation, self, support, and strategies. And I think most notably for students within the situation factor is whether they have experience with a similar transition. The degree to which a student is able to manage the situation can influence their experience with the situation. And the self factor of Schlossberg's theory includes demographic characteristics as well as psychological resources that students can use to cope with the transition. And I found many studies in the literature showing how demographic characteristics such as race and ethnicity may influence transfer students' experiences. And then additionally, Schlossberg indicates that one aspect of the psychological resources that exist with coping with a transition is self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is often part of the literature on transfer student capital. So the degree to which a student possesses transfer student capital and self-efficacy may have a significant influence on the coping skills they're able to implement during their transition. The fourth factor, support, can look different depending on the student, but most notable to this study is institutional support. And I found a study by Ogilvy and Knight that said that students transferring to an institution that has a culture of low support for transfer students, or one in which transfer students are overtly or covertly stigmatized for their transfer student identity, may experience difficulty in adjusting academically. So these factors of coping from Schlossberg's theory really provide a framework for my proposed study to help, the reader conceptualize the internal transfer student experiences within these factors. Both coping skills and transfer capital will be present as student characteristic variables in the model, which I'll talk about in a second. And the proposed study will investigate whether these characteristics influence student sense of belonging and their experience with stigma, and whether that has an effect on students' educational outcomes. So with all this in mind, we have a couple of research questions. My study will seek to answer 4 primary research questions. The first being, do internal lateral transfer students experience transfer shock post-transition? Is there a relationship between the degree to which a student self-reports experiences with stigma related to their identity as an internal transfer student and their post-transfer GPA? What influence does possessing the identity of an internal transfer student have on these students' sense of belonging? And then lastly, which student characteristics are influential in internal lateral transfer students' experience with belonging, stigma, and transfer shock? And this image on the slide integrates elements from the literature and from the theoretical framework and serves as the conceptual framework for this study, wherein both student sense of belonging post-transition and their experience with stigma post-transition will be investigated in relationship to the students' educational outcomes. For the purpose of this study, The educational outcomes that will be utilized will be first semester post-transition GPA, and I'll use that in comparison to their pre-transition GPA, and this will help identify transfer shock. And then under the student characteristics, the list of student characteristics in the framework is not exhaustive of all possible characteristics that a student could have, but they are characteristics that have found to be influential in transfer students' academic and social adjustment experiences within the literature, which is why they've been included here. And in order to investigate this topic, the study will employ a non-experimental correlational explanatory research design that'll use multiple linear regression statistics to understand this relationship between belonging, stigma, and educational outcomes. As I alluded to at the beginning of my presentation, the proposed study will utilize participants from one land-grant multi-campus institution in the Mid-Atlantic region. You can guess which one that is. And then approximately 2,500 of the 3,500 students who change campus within the university system each fall transition from one of the regional campuses to the flagship campus. So the flagship campus receives the largest number of these students each fall, and that is who I will focus on in this study. So the proposed study will only look at students transitioning from the regional campus to the flagship campus. In order to gather data, I'll use a combination of survey data and institutional data. I have created a survey instrument that utilizes questions from two existing instruments. The first is the Leonard Transfer Student Questionnaire, which is referred to as the LTSQ, and I'll be using the modified version that was modified by Moser in 2012, and that is an instrument that is very prevalent in the transfer student literature. And then the second instrument that'll be used for the proposed study is the Sense of Social Fit Scale that was developed by Walton and Cohen. So both the modified LTSQ and the Sense of Social Fit Scale will be combined and to create one instrument that'll be administered to the sample. In addition to the survey, I plan to utilize institutional data, specifically term GPA, in order to measure educational outcomes. So GPA information will be collected from students who complete the survey and consent to the collection of their GPA. A multiple regression analysis will be used to determine which variables are influential on the educational outcomes of internal lateral transfer students. A first regression will be used to determine which of those student characteristics serving as independent variables influence students' sense of belonging. And then the second regression will be used where the student characteristics will serve as the independent variables and the dependent variable will be experience with stigma. And then a third regression will include the dependent variable as students post-transition GPA, and the independent variables will include reported experience with stigma and sense of belonging post-transition. So in this last regression, the demographic variables would be held constant. And in addition to the regressions, the study will also determine if the internal lateral transfer students experience transfer shock and to what extent by comparing the pre-transition GPA with the first semester post-transition GPA. I do acknowledge that there are some limitations to this study. One of the limitations of this study is that it only consists of students from one institution. Because of the single site nature of this study, the results may not be generalizable to other institutions. And then similarly, the study only explores the experiences of students transitioning from the regional campus to the flagship campus. So it leaves out students who transition from one regional campus to another or who leave the flagship campus for a regional campus. So those students' experiences may not be represented in the findings of this study. And then a second limitation for the study is that it does rely on attitudinal measures. So the proposed study does rely on students to self-report their responses on the survey instrument with their experiences with stigma and belonging, which could lead to discrepancies in the accuracy of their responses. And despite these limitations, here on the slide are my anticipated results of the study. The first is that the study will show internal lateral transfer students do experience transfer shock. So this means that their GPA in their first semester post-transition will be lower than their GPA at their last semester at their previous campus. And this hypothesis is consistent with the 2023 study on internal lateral transfer students that did indicate that students in that study experienced transfer shock. The second anticipated outcome is that students who experience a greater sense of belonging will have a higher post-transition GPA, meaning that they will experience transfer shock to a lesser extent if they experience higher levels of sense of belonging. Similar to that, the third anticipated result is that students who experience greater levels of stigma regarding their identity as an internal lateral transfer student will have a lower post-transition GPA. And both of the second and third hypothesis here really highlight the connectedness between stigma, sense of belonging, and educational outcomes. And then a final anticipated result is that students' demographic characteristics, coping skills, and transfer capital acquisition will influence their sense of belonging and post-transition GPA. Understanding how these different criteria and characteristics affect students' belonging and post-transition GPA will really allow practitioners to implement both academic and social initiatives to support this student population, and it'll also allow for a focused effort related to certain student demographic characteristics. And then additionally, it'll also provide new insight regarding how Schlossberg's 4 factors can be applied to working with transfer students. The proposed study will be the first to use to explore the relationship between stigma, sense of belonging, and post-transition GPA for the internal lateral transfer student population. And because of this, it'll be filling a gap in the literature in the field of transfer studies. And then by determining if there is a relationship between belonging, stigma, and post-transition GPA, like I said before, practitioners will be able to develop supports and initiatives to enhance sense of belonging for transfer students on their campus and really start to battle some of those negative stereotypes that exist on their campus. So this degree of insight is really critical to understanding this transfer student population on a new level. And I am happy to answer any questions that you might have or provide any clarity.